On today's episode of Axe Hacks, I'm going to be souping up this Gibson Les Paul Custom with a set of Bare Knuckle Black Hawks. So in the last pickup install video that I did, I pulled a set of passive pickups in favor of a set of active EMGs. For this video, I'm going to be doing the opposite. I'm going to pull this 85-85 set that's in this Gibson Les Paul in favor of the bare knuckles. While this type of installation is quite a bit more complicated than installing a set of actives, I probably won't be able to touch on every wiring decision that I'm making because there are so many different types of wiring diagrams available. However, I will be sure to touch on anything that would be universally applicable to wiring a set of passive pickups. Okay, so really quick, I wanted to go over some of the basic differences you're going to see between active and passive pickup wiring. So in addition to the passive pickups themselves, we are going to have a different value of potentiometer, or in the Les Paul's case, 4 different potentiometers. So with humbuckers, you're typically going to have 500K value pots, whereas with the active setup, these little guys are 25K. So dramatically different value. If we were wiring up single coils, these would be 250K, so you want to be sure to pay attention to the pot value depending on the types of pickups you're installing. Another thing you might have noticed about these potentiometers specifically is they look a little bit different than your typical ones. That's because these are what are called push-pull potentiometers, which allow for coil splitting. Basically what this does is it takes a humbucker and it splits it into 2 separate single coils. This is really cool because you can take a guitar that would normally be, geared just for metal or, just for kind of heavier music with the humbuckers and split it to get more of a Strat or Tele sound out of it. So that's one nice thing about passive electronics, is it adds a lot of flexibility and a lot of options to your wiring scheme. So after the potentiometers, the next thing that we would be looking at is the capacitors. So the capacitor is always going to go between the hot terminals of your volume and tone controls. This is what makes your tone control work. With a humbucker setup, you're usually going to have a 0.022 UF or 0.022 microfarad capacitor, whereas with a single coil setup, you would have a 0.047. All that value difference does is change the frequency at where the high end starts to roll off when you roll your tone control back. And lastly, the only other thing off the top of my head I can think of that is going to be different is your output jack. So with a passive setup, you would just have a regular unbalanced mono output jack. I really like the Switchcraft ones. Whereas you can see with the EMG setup, they have their own, I believe also made by Switchcraft, but this is a stereo jack. And the reason why is that since they are active electronics, they're actually electronically balanced. This is part of the reason why in an active system you don't necessarily have to have a bridge ground or some of the extra wiring that you would have to have in a passive setup because it's all pretty much electronically isolated. So all that being said, let's get back into the guitar. Now let's see what we've got under the battery. There will be one nice thing about switching to passives from actives is you'll never have to worry about a battery again. We'll pull that out. And pretty much this whole assembly is going to have to be replaced, so really we can kind of just pull the whole thing out. And if you watched my last video about the EMG installation, those had the more recent EMG pickup bus where everything is pretty much plug and play. As you can see here, this is kind of an older version of EMG's wiring where everything is actually still soldered. to the backs of the pots. So I'm going to go ahead and warm up my soldering iron and we'll get all this removed. Okay, now I've got my soldering iron warmed up, and I also just remembered that we need to free up the output jack from the side of the guitar over here. So I'm going to go ahead and unscrew the jack plate. That's going to be with a 13mm socket. And really, I can pull the main pickup leads through the cavities without desoldering them, just like that. What we do have to desolder, though, are the switch terminals. So let's see, it looks like we have a black, a red, a white, and a brown coming off of that. And actually, now that I see how much lead is left on all of these, instead of desoldering them, I'm just going to clip them. Great, now we can actually just remove this entire EMG wiring harness because all of it is going to be replaced with the passive electronics. Okay, so moving forward from this point, I'm going to be using one of these guys. So as you can see, it's fairly complicated. It's called a wiring diagram. I use one of these for every set of passive pickups that I install. As much as I would like to be able to say that I know how to wire passive pickups, I know some fundamentals, but as far as the specifics of where each wire goes in every configuration, there are literally hundreds of wiring possibilities with passive electronics. So I will include a link to where you can find all of the different configurations for bare knuckle pickups, and then down in the description you'll be able to find links to, you know, DiMarzio and Seymour Duncan wiring diagrams. So one thing that I will get into is I need to find the bridge ground wire, and whoever installed the EMGs thought that it would be a really good idea to go ahead and clip it. So basically I have this tiny little 1/4 inch of bridge ground wire sticking out. Luckily, I think it's just barely enough to bend into a hook and loop this guy around it. And then I can go ahead and solder them together, and then I'll have a new bridge ground wire. Okay, now I'm going to strip some insulation off of the leads coming from the switch. Okay, so that we actually have some wires to work with in the control cavity, let's go ahead and install the pickups into the top of the guitar. So I'm just going to feed the wiring down through the body cavity. And so now we'll grab the pickup mounting screws, the ring, and the tension springs. So I'm just going to feed this through. I'll do one side at a time. Put the spring on there, and very carefully compress the spring and start threading the screw into the tab. Alright, there's one. We'll do the same thing for the other side. Okay, with those finally in and compressed, we can lower this down into the cavity. Okay, and just a quick tip here. When you're tightening down screws to the body of a guitar on top of something that's plastic like a pickup ring or a pick guard, these things barely have to be tightened down. I mean, just enough to keep them attached to the body, and that's pretty much it. This is how you avoid cracking your pickup ring or cracking your pick guard. Alright, there we go. Pickups are mounted. Let's flip it over and really get into the wiring. Okay, now we've got our pickup leads coming through. One thing that I noticed pretty much right away is that the amount of shielding that is stripped back isn't nearly enough to give us the flexibility in wiring that we're going to need, kind of spreading these leads out from pot to pot here in the cavity. So what I like to use to strip off this outer shielding is just a regular X-Acto knife, and gently kind of roll this across the blade while twisting it. Make it cut all the way around, and you don't want to cut too deep because then you're just going to end up cutting into the insulation for the smaller wires on the inside. So just very slowly get through it all the way around, and then you should just be able to pull it off. There we go. And now on the inside of that, there's going to be a little bit of foil. Just peel that off and cut it and throw it away. We don't need that for anything. There we go. That is probably enough lead wire. Looking at this schematic, it looks like the green and whites stay together, so I'll just leave those soldered. They're already soldered for both pickups. And then for these smaller wires, rather than using the X-Acto knife method, if you have a pair of small wire cutters like this, otherwise known as dikes, if you go down just about, half an inch or so, squeeze gently and then pull, you can usually get your shielding to just pop off at the length that you need, rather than having to have, dedicated wire strippers or anything like that. Okay, now with those stripped, let's go ahead and wire up our output jack. Like I said, just a standard mono jack, and what I'm going to use is just some stranded 22 gauge wire from Radio Shack. Also, as far as the type of solder that we're using, also from Radio Shack, is just a normal 60/40. I used to use the silver bearing stuff, but even though it makes prettier solder joints, it's a pain in the ass to work with, so I just decided to go this route, and it's been much, much easier. So I'm just going to kind of measure out a decent length of wire, cut a piece of red and a piece of black. Okay, the two connections you're going to make to the output jack are the hot, which is going to connect to the tip, and the ground, which is going to connect to the sleeve. So I'm going to wire up the sleeve first. And the sleeve is really easy to identify because it is whichever one is coming directly off of this bottom sort of almost grommet looking flange here. So what I usually do for these nice big open terminals like this is just bend. I really like wiring with hooks, I guess. Just go ahead and bend a hook into the stranded wire, loop that through, kind of clamp it down with your fingertips once it's through, and then go ahead and solder it. Great, and then just to keep the installation clean, I usually like to take these two strands and kind of twist them together just to keep your two output jack wires nice and clean in the control cavity. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and screw this to the output jack plate here on the Les Paul. You always want to use a lock washer. I wanted to go ahead and talk about soldering to the backs of pots. So I don't know if these come with kind of a wax or some other corrosion inhibitor coating the outside of the metal, but out of the packaging, solder does not stick to it very easily. So one of the connections this is having me make, which is fairly common, is to bend this third lug in, and then we're going to solder that directly to the casing of the pot. What I like to do on these connections is just take that same X-Acto knife and scrape off that coating right under the lug, right where the solder is going to go. And once you see shiny bare metal under it, the solder typically sticks to it much more easily. So I'm going to take my soldering iron, and rather than applying the solder directly to the tip, I'm going to have the tip hang out here on the pot for a little while, get it nice and hot, and then apply the solder. You see a lot of failed soldering jobs on the pots where the pot casing was not hot enough when the soldering was done, and it just pops right off. There we go. Nice solid solder connection. And while we're talking about passive pots, I'm not really sure what function these little tabs are supposed to serve, but on every passive pot I see, they have one of these things. It's just like a little, I don't know if it's supposed to be a like a stabilizer tab that's supposed to dig into the wood when you tighten it down, or what the deal is. I've never found any use for it. The pots stay where they're supposed to stay just fine with the lock washer, just so long as you are sure to keep it under the pot when you put it through the body. So I always just break these off if it is a cast one like this. So just grab your wire cutters, twist, and that'll just break off really easily. The other type that you'll see is on, say, this the longer shaft push-pull pot that we have. It's not cast, it's actually part of the bent chassis here. And for that, I'm just going to bend it. Great, now that'll stay out of our way when we go to put it through the guitar. Okay, now moving forward from here, I'm really just going to pretty much dive into whatever connections this handy-dandy diagram is going to tell me to go over. I'm probably just going to go ahead and blast through it, and then I'll explain any of the common connections once everything is together and visible. Okay, I am going to take a second here and go over this stuff, heat shrink tubing. What I'm going to be using it on is the connection between the switch's output, which I traced back up to the switch to find it's actually this small black wire, and the tip wire from the output jack. So what I'm going to do is take the heat shrink tubing and slide it over one of these wires first. And then I'm going to try to solder these two together in the most low profile way possible so that I can get that heat shrink tubing slid back over them. Now I'm just going to slide this tubing over the connection. Now I'm just going to run the soldering iron up next to the heat shrink, and it's going to suck up right against those wires. Okay, and at last we have arrived at my Achilles heel of passive pickup installations, that being the ground wiring network. So, not that it's necessarily difficult, it's just time consuming and tedious. So, for example, in this particular wiring setup, we're going to be wiring soldering two connections from each of these push-pull pots to itself, to its own chassis ground. That is for both the neck and the bridge pickup. We're going to be soldering the ground wire from the switch. We're going to be soldering the ground from the bridge, which we extended earlier. We're going to be soldering the shield and the ground from each one of the pickups. And in addition to all that, we're going to be soldering each pot to each other so that we sort of have a circuit of grounds. Oh, and the shield wire, or the ground wire for the switch. Okay, at long last, I am done with wiring. Just to kind of further emphasize the complexity of wiring passive electronics, I just took the time to go through and count the number of wired solder connections were involved with this particular installation, and given this is a fairly complicated one with the coil splits and everything, but this install consisted of 40 different wired connections, or different soldered connections rather. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get the pots installed in the top. So for these two lower ones, these pot shafts are just normal length. So all we're going to put on these are locking washers, and once those are on, I'm going to go ahead and push those through the top. And now these two, since we are dealing with a Gibson Les Paul, are what are called long shaft pots. This one, I think when I was measuring earlier, this one is actually going to have a little more excess sticking out of the top than this one is. So what we want to do is actually put a nut on here first so that we can adjust and sort of fine-tune just how much of this is going to be sticking up through the top. Okay, now we'll flip the guitar over and see exactly what we're dealing with as far as this pot length goes. Okay, so basically what I've been doing to check this height, if you will, of how much thread is going to be sticking through the top. So really we only need about 2 or 3 threads at this point, because when we start to tighten the nut down, it's going to pull it through a little bit more, because it's going to be pulling those locking washers that are on the back side here into the wood a little bit, so that'll give us another thread or so. So basically these two are going to be the main ones that we're dealing with here on the Les Paul, and I've got them adjusted so that on this front main neck volume, there is really, it's the nut is barely compensating for anything. It's only going up about 2 threads, so I'm going to keep that where it is. And then on the push-pull back here for the tone, this one had to be fine-tuned a little bit more. This one is about 1/3 of the way up, that I would say, and we want to leave those right about where they are. Okay, so I've managed to get the threads started on each one of these volume and tone pots. So I've got my 13mm socket here, and what I'm going to do is hold the back, just wrap my fingers around and hold the back of the pots to make sure they don't turn as I'm tightening them down here on the top. Okay, with the pickups finally installed, all we have left to do is set the pickup height. Now the way that we're going to do this is we're going to start with the pickups fairly low down away from the strings, and while we let the two lowest or two highest open strings ring out, adjust that given side of the pickup higher and higher. So what you're listening for as you raise the pickup is an increase in low end response. Once the pickup is high enough to where low end is no longer being added, that is pretty much where the sweet spot is going to be, because if you go any higher beyond that, you're going to start to lose note definition in bigger chords. Everything's going to sound kind of muffly and oversaturated. And I actually find that this is easier to hear with a distorted tone as opposed to a clean tone. Maybe that's just because everything is kind of exaggerated in a distorted tone. But anyway, we'll get into that and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Okay, we'll start with the bridge pickup. Okay, I think that's pretty good for the bridge pickup height. Now I'll move on to the neck. And for the higher strings, you're not necessarily listening for the addition of low end, since they don't really have any. You're more just listening for kind of body and character to come more up front. So now what I'm doing is balancing the pickups, which is really just making very, very small adjustments in height between the front and back to make sure that the levels are the same between the two. Alright, I would say that those are pretty much set. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to illustrate here is really how flexible passive pickup wiring can be, especially in a 4-pot 2-humbucker configuration like we have here. So normally with the EMGs that we removed, we would have 3 options essentially. We would have just the bridge humbucker, both of the humbuckers together, or just the neck. We can certainly do that with this setup, but since we installed the coil taps with our three-way switch here, we can have, you know, just the bridge. We can have the single coil version of the bridge. We can have both the neck and bridge humbucker together. And then while in this mode, we can split just one of them if we want to. And then of course just the neck. And just the neck split. Well, thanks for sticking with me through my passive pickup install video. As always, my name is Chris. You've been watching Axe Hacks. If you dug the information, go ahead and subscribe to the YouTube channel. As for today, I will leave you by playing a song from the band. It's on my shirt.